Hello, hello guys, hello. Hi everybody, hello. Hello guys, do you hear me? Do you have my voice? Please type yes if you hear me. Do you hear me guys? Yes. Hello. Hello guys. Yes. Okay, great. That's great. That's awesome. Thank you so much. Wow, 500 people just in 10 seconds. Thank you so much for joining this live session. As you all know, we started this interview series for being a source of inspiration and encouragement for you guys to stay at home and also spreading the knowledge around the world globally with every designers and architects. So we invite architecture pioneers and design pioneers to come to join to our live sessions and share their experiences, visions with their projects and show the way that our world is going. So in a couple of minutes, I will just invite Richard Hassell, founding director of WOHA Architects, a Singapore-based practice. WOHA is a Singapore-based architectural practice founded by Wong, Summ, and Richard Hassell in 1994, and they have gained global recognition for their integration of environmental and social practice at every stage of design. They have designed a diverse amount of innovative and highly influential projects which have been built in a number of cities and countries, and their best known project has been widely publicized as benchmarks and sustainable design. Okay, I'm now going to invite Richard to this live session. Stay tuned, and we're there. There we go. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Hamid. How are you?
I'm super fine. Thank you so much. I think my headphone has a problem. Let me try to reconnect it again. Do you hear me?
Can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I hear you completely. That's great. Thank you.
Good.
Nice to see you here. Thanks for accepting our interview request.
To
start, the mic is yours if you want to say to our followers.
Oh no, this is my first time going on Instagram Live, so forgive me if something goes wrong, but I'm excited to be talking to architecture and design and to have a conversation with you, Hamid. It'll be fun, I think.
That's great. Just one suggestion. Could you please just move a bit of your camera, a bit of your phone to down, and your head comes to up? Okay, that's perfect. Yeah, that's perfect. That's great. Okay, at first, and I would like to announce that we can get our questions from our followers. Anybody who's watching can just write down the questions in the question tab. And at the end of the live session, we will ask a couple of questions from our followers. So let's get into the show. Would you please introduce yourself to our followers and how you ended up being a founding director of WOHA Architects and your story about becoming an architect?
Sure. Yes, so my name is Richard Hassell. I grew up in Perth in Western Australia. And I actually, for some reason, never thought of being an architect, even though I loved doing technical drawing in high school and designing things. But my heart was set on being an artist, actually. And so when I graduated from high school, I decided to do fine art and become a painter. And then it was only after a year of that where I thought, it's a bit of a lonely profession. You know, sort of you get a lot into your own head. And I thought, I really don't want to do this. And then it was like this thunderclap. I thought, architecture, why aren't I doing architecture? So it was a little bit strange. I then started it and just loved it, and done it ever since. So that was back in 1980. I think I started my architecture degree.
How old are
And
you?
then, no, 1989, I finished my architecture degree. I'm old.
You don't look
I'm
old, actually.
54 this year. No,
Oh,
so
you look
pretty
like
old.
45, 43, 44.
Must be the stress kind of keeping me young. And then, so when I did graduate, which was in 1989, that was actually the last time Australia was in this really bad recession. So there were no jobs for architects. And that's when I moved and came to Singapore, because Singapore was still doing quite well financially. And once again, I really enjoyed it here. It was in the middle of Southeast Asia, which is surrounded by amazing vernacular architecture and traditional architecture, and also one of the fastest growing regions. So there was, compared to Perth, where I'd been studying, which is quite a small city,
Right.
to be surrounded by these sort of big cities and a lot of development. It was sort of fun because you could sort of sense that there was a chance to change things,
Right.
because so much was transforming. While I'd always felt in Perth it was sort of done already,
Right.
The city was there, it was very nice. So the sort of architects were doing mainly, residential work and things, which was quite nice. But it was sort of Asia, you got the sense you could engage with sort of development in the world and have a chance to influence that.
Yeah, great. So how did you end up with starting an architecture practice with a colleague, with a friend? What happens? Why did you
Oh yeah,
start this
so well,
office?
I started working here so it was 1990 when I started, and then for 5 years worked at Kerry Hill Architects, which is a well-known practice in this part of the world,
Mm-hmm.
mainly doing resort work. And then after 4 years of that, so 1994, I'd been working with a colleague, which was Summ, and we got on really well and had sort of very similar training at university, very similar attitude to design, and we didn't drive each other crazy in the high stress uh,
Actually, that's the
environment and with
key to get
deadlines.
a partner.
It is. I think you need to stress test it, and so he's a very steady person. I'm probably a little more
Right.
stressful than he is, so he might have the bad end of the deal. But overall, we get along very well, and I think we try and have a very happy practice. And I mean, people work really hard. We've got this amazing crew of 100 people now,
Yes.
but we try and keep it always, I mean, very serious in terms of our work, but lighthearted and happy in terms of the mood of the office.
That's great. That's great. So with this current situation of pandemic and COVID-19, how this pandemic affected your office, WOHA?
Yeah, well, it was with 100 people, it's quite a major impact to try and figure out how to move it all to working from home. Uh, but Singapore had quite a slow ease into the lockdown because we had cases since January, some of the first exported cases in the world. And so we could see it coming, but we had quite a few weeks to prepare for it. So testing out the software, figuring out how to share files online and people working out of their bedrooms. So it's like that now, and it is challenging. I mean, when you're used to sitting down next to people or sitting in a group and having group discussion, it's
Right.
quite, although Zoom and all these things, it's not bad, but it's something about sort of wrestling for the pen on the butter paper and those sort of discussions, which it feels a little bit detached online. But I
Right.
think we're building up skills as the weeks go on.
Right.
I'm now sort of always on the iPad drawing over things, and it's getting a little easier. And we're actually quite curious to see after this whether it makes sense that we continue it as a way of working for the people that it suits. Yeah, so we're trying to look at it very positively, as maybe this is a sort of catapult into next generation working or very flexible working. We
Right.
already have completely flexible hours at our office, so people can
Mm-hmm.
come in and leave whenever they want. So this could just be the next step where we never see them again.
Right. So what do you think this current situation will affect architecture in the future, our lifestyles, our way of living, urban life? What do you think?
I mean, it's a little hard to say because, I mean, there's been pandemics before, so it's not something totally new. But I was reading an interesting article on Slate magazine, I think it was, about how the 1918 pandemic actually was a big driver behind the international modern style, the sort of sanatorium, architecture, clean, bright, sort of free of germs, very hygienic.
Yes.
So it was, I think there was a change in mindset, which did transform architecture. So it's probably a little soon to tell because I think everyone's sort of hungering in a way for the life they had a few weeks ago. So there's a great sort of a drive to go back the way it was, but at the same time, you really
Right.
notice, like, if you're watching TV and you see a whole crowd of people and they're all hugging and kissing each other, you're going, oh, that's not right, you know, so that it's sort of already transformed the way we look at crowds and
Yes.
people together. And I'm not sure how long it will take us to get over that or whether there'll be something of that permanently.
Yes.
But I think in some ways, Singapore, Hong Kong, when we had SARS, it was very similar. I was here during SARS and it was very frightening because I think SARS, the death rate was very high and affected people of all ages. So, you know, it was very personal that you felt you might be dead next week for everybody through the city. And so there was a sort of a culture of the hygiene, the not touching lift buttons, all the things that everybody's going through now was learnt that time.
Yes.
But I have to say, like a year later, we were all back to normal. It didn't
Hopefully.
last that long.
Hopefully.
No, but I mean, our attitude towards hygiene and shaking hands and things actually returned.
Yes.
Some things, like in Hong Kong, you don't share, like they have serving chopsticks rather than everyone digging in with a dish. So there were certain things that did change culturally from the SARS experience. So I imagine we'll have that with this too. Yeah.
Great. So I'd like to go with your projects. First of all, what guides you through the project when you start to design?
I guess it's probably changed over the years because as we've evolved our position and what we think is important, I guess we now have a set of criteria that we think are really important in terms of even selecting the job. And I think those are really, I mean, it's pretty broad based around, can this project make a difference in terms of imagining a better future? So we try and avoid projects that we feel are just business as usual. I mean, the brief might be business as usual, but in talking to the client, we get a sense, you know, is there a possibility to push this in a certain direction that could be interesting? And so that better future, a lot of it comes down to sustainability. Like, can we achieve some new incremental improvement in sustainability? But we've sort of come to realize that sustainability on its own is no use. It has to be grounded in the sort of cultural and community sense. Like it's sort of in the commons. And so there's a lot of interest in our firm in, is this project all sort of worthy from the commons point of view? So if it's super luxury, super exclusive, super about consumption, we feel like, you know, there's not much we can do there. And so that's where we try and do, we've done Enabling Village, which is a community project. We've done public housing. We like to do public projects as well, because I think there's a lot more opportunity to engage with these issues.
Right.
And so, yeah, we try and keep it very broad across a lot of types. And yeah, and then I guess we've also, in a way, have a series of approaches that we've tried and tested before. So we have a little bit of a sort of magic bag of tricks in terms of how we organize projects and achieve cross ventilation and shading and the way to integrate greenery. So a bit like Christopher Alexander's pattern language. So we have a sort of series of patterns, but it's quite interesting to apply them in different scales, like from very super high rise or a single story building. And it wasn't really intentional. It was sort of after we wrote a book called Garden City Megacity, where we did a sort of self-analysis on our projects, and that's where we were kind of surprised. We're going, oh, we actually we do the same thing over and over again, but in quite different building forms and typologies. Yeah.
Right. So I'll ask about Park Royal project, which you defined as topographical architecture, and it is a very good example of a green architecture. When we look at this project, we see you have just turned a hotel to a public and global like space. Everybody can just come and visit. How did you manage to create a project as a green spaces for the public? I love this project, actually. It's in the background. You see on the screen.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Actually, that one was, we're pretty excited because it was very close to our office. So one thing, we knew the site very well, and it's opposite this park, which was actually donated by a philanthropist. And so one of the early ideas, we thought it would be really cool if we could, just as that philanthropist donated 1.5 hectares of greenery for the city, like, is there any way we could make our project achieve the same kind of quantum of greenery? And then we thought, oh, the hotel is a perfect opportunity, really, because hotels are really, their product is basically an environmental experience. You know, you go to a hotel, you're choosing it because it looks like a great place to stay and you really want to experience and enjoy all the spaces. So it was a sort of perfect project in that we saw that a kind of sustainable and philanthropic move would also align with the business objectives of a hotel, so we wouldn't face a lot of resistance. You know, if we could do it in such a way that the guests would want to come and stay there to experience it, then that means from the hotel developer's point of view, it's a smart move. You know, it's not the architect making them spend crazy amounts of money on something that is off their business case. It was still quite difficult to get it to work financially because, you know, it's a lot of extra stuff. But we realized when we looked at their feasibility study, they'd actually factored in a really big basement for all the back of house and the car parking and mechanical areas. And actually basements are super expensive. They're, you know, you've got to dig this big hole in the ground and they're really bad environmentally. There's a huge amount of energy to build it, and then they just eat a lot of energy for the rest of their lives. You know, you've got to pump water out of them and you've got to pump air into them and you've got to light them artificially. So we thought, oh, if we could find a way of getting rid of the basement, we could actually use all that budget and all that time saving to spend on the gardens. And so that was the sort of way we could get it to work financially. And then after that, we had this, it was really interesting. It's like, what is a building in the CBD that has so much garden? You know, what would that look like? And another concept we're interested in is sort of things that are not just one thing, like can they be both one thing and something else? And so we thought it'd be interesting if this was a really kind of civic building that had a civic presence at the same time as being a landscape. And could we get those two things to work simultaneously?
Right.
Yeah. And so, and I think it sort of worked really well. People feel like they're in a resort at the same time they're in an inner city urban hotel. And so the sort of experience of that simultaneity is actually something very attractive to the modern business traveler or tourist. You know, they sort of get a whole lot of experiences at once. So we think it's something quite interesting to do in future projects. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, great project. Thank you. I would like to tell to our followers that you can write the questions in the question section. I will check all of them at the end to ask from Richard. Thank you. So I will ask about Osio Hotel project in downtown, which you call it a living tower, right?
Yes.
Living tower, yeah.
So yes,
This building generously presents itself to public with landscape and sky gardens. How such a structure came to life?
with that one, I guess after Park Royal, Park Royal we actually achieved 200% of the site as green area. So we managed to get the 1.5 hectares on. So we thought it would be really interesting to push this even further. And another aspect that had come about was, people saying, oh, these green buildings are kind of interesting, but what are you going to do with a city that's already mostly built up? It's never going to become a green city. And we thought, well, that's not actually true. If we could make one project have so much greenery on it, it could compensate for projects that had none. Then you could have a sort of acupuncture approach where you could just have some of these buildings through the city, and overall your green plot ratio would be still quite decent. So WOHA, we actually achieve 1,100% green plot ratio, so 11 times the site area in greenery.
Right.
And which is quite an interesting figure, because that means, just 10% of sites in the city that were done like this, and you would have an average of 100% across the city. So that was one idea. The other one was as a form. It was not something like Park Royal where we had a sort of horizontal aspect to play with, and I think it was quite a built-up site. So we thought it's just a sort of different way of using landscape rather than landscape as a sort of metaphor or using it as a topographic expression. Here we saw it as landscape as a finish, really. So we were cladding the whole building in greenery, and it's almost like a bower structure, or like a garden structure where you grow, creepers over an archway or a pergola or a gazebo, one of those kind of forms.
Yeah, great. I would like to ask about Skyville project as well. We see a divided village in this project. And could you tell us a little bit about this Sky Village that meets almost all needs of users and allow them to socialize?
Yes, so we were really excited to do this project because we'd actually done a competition in 2000 for a project in Singapore, which we were in the sort of shortlisted top 5, but we didn't win it. And it was actually a project for us which had so many ideas in it. We've been exploring them ever since. Right. And so I think we started Skyville in 2008. So sort of 8 years later, wow. There was a sort of chance to have another go at it. And so it was quite similar in terms of the brief. It was a project with many, many apartments. So in this case, it was 960 apartments in one building. And, that's the size of a town in in Europe. And so, exactly. It seemed wrong to just see it as a building stuffed with apartments. We said, and being social housing, we felt like the social contract, this idea of the commons, the idea that we're looking after each other was really important. And we thought in order for that to really work, people had to get to know their neighbours, we thought, because it's like the essence would be then that you know your neighbours, if you need someone to water your pot plants or to run and get help if something has gone wrong. We need to create the kind of environment where people have that old-fashioned spirit that they used to have in a village on the ground. And it's quite difficult to achieve in high-rise because high-rise space is usually at a premium. And when you are meeting people, you're sort of squashed in the lift with them. And you don't necessarily want to make friends with someone in the lift because, you're a bit nervous they might follow you home or something. It's a kind of a tense social space. And right. We realized that social space where people feel comfortable is always horizontal. Like you're happy meeting people in the park or walking on the street, but it's never really vertical. And so we thought there's a real problem with the typology of high-rise in that it's inherently sort of antisocial architecture. And how can we address this in a high-rise? So the project's 47 stories tall, so it's quite a high project. And we thought, right. Well, firstly, and 960 people, that was the other problem, like too many people. You can never know all your neighbours when there's 960 families exactly. there. So we thought so the key is really breaking it down into sort of smaller social groups where people would feel a sense of a neighbourhood and ideally, then they would have a horizontal space where they would meet their neighbours in a very casual and non-threatening way, sort of as they go through their daily routine. And that's when you start saying hello and patting their dog and, you know, chatting, or maybe the kids get together and do some study. And so the idea was to break it into 12 villages of 80 homes, because we thought 80 homes is not so bad. That's sort of a sort of little neighborhood or a village size. And then the challenge was, how do we actually get someone, when they're just coming home from work, catching the lift, going to their apartment, how would we put them in a social space? And so we developed this idea of creating a kind of vertical volume. So we have basically 11 floors and 8 units a floor, but then we drop some out for the common space. So that's the 80 units. So you get out of the lift, you look down into the space. That's where you would see your neighbor. You could just wave to them, you know, hi, Mrs. Wong. Or you could see your own kids down there. You go, you know,
Fantastic.
kids, I'm coming home. Come up for dinner soon. So we just wanted that sort of ability. We did some study and found about 25 to 30 meters is the distance where you can see somebody's face. So that translated to the 11 stories of the public housing floor-to-floor height. And it's working really well. There's been a recent study done by the National University of Singapore, and they found that the people living in Skyville know a substantially higher number of neighbours than people in typical blocks.
Yeah, exactly. Very brilliant project. We have a good question from one of our followers. I'm just popping it up here. Who are your biggest influences?
I know, it's a funny question, because I think in some ways, I think architects are sort of creative practitioners. You tend to be project-based and you're looking for things that will help you solve a particular problem.
Yes.
But I had a very classical training at university. So, you know, all the modernist heroes, Le Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright, Louis Kahn, and Carlos Scarpa for detailing. These are all beautiful things. Yes. I did find after that, sort of as I started practice, Herzog and de Meuron, OMA, I really loved their clarity in setting the problem, and the sort of the way they come at a problem without a lot of baggage and do something that afterwards seems inevitable. You know, it's such a sensible, logical idea that flows from the problem they've set themselves, but it's incredibly innovative when you know, see how other people address the problem. And that kind of ability to try and look clearly at a problem and not come at it as something where you have a lot of preconceived solutions is something we try and do. It's sort of a bit funny at the same time. I said we have a lot of sort of bag of tricks. But I think the sort of the tricks are strategies that help us solve particular technical problems. But we like the big concept to try and be as open as possible. You know, so it's a bit like we have the verbs and the adjectives and the words, but in terms of the story, we try and come very fresh to the story. Yeah,
exactly. So we have another good question from one of our followers. I will just pop it up here. Okay, also I was going to ask this question. What do you think is the future of sustainable architecture? Is it just in words, or we will have sustainability in the future in mostly in our architecture projects, or not?
I think in some ways, like architecture, I think is not the solution. I think architecture has to be part of the solution, but there's a limit to how much one building can achieve on its own. And I think it's really an issue again of the commons. Like, as a collective society, how do we solve this problem of the climate emergency and global heating? And how do we sort of together as a politically and as a society agree that certain things have to be done and certain things have to be invested in and changed? At the same time, there's no point in having that agreement if we don't have sort of solutions for all the components. So we've been very interested in systems thinking, systems theory, because we can see that our architecture is just one part of a much bigger system. And in some ways, you can't really have one without the other. So I think sort of currently where we are politically at the moment seems to be going in the opposite direction to achieving sustainability. And it's quite heartbreaking in many ways, I think, to see sort of consensus falling apart and everything becoming politicized in really unfortunate ways. I think Singapore, where I live, is really interesting in that they do build consensus as a society. It's a key political tool, and are very focused on data and very focused on what's happening in the future. And I think that kind of whole of government coordination of solutions to a problem is really important. And I think it's difficult because we've got all different kinds of situations around the world, and obviously if only 25% of people are addressing the problem and the other 75% are making it worse, it can be it can be a little disheartening, I think. But I actually think people at heart, everybody wants this, really. Like, I don't think anybody wants to live in an apocalyptic hellhole.
Right.
It's just a matter, I think, often people can't see the path there that makes sense to them, or they feel like it's just they're being asked to give up a lot of things. But our experience is like any client, even hard-nosed, very, very financially focused client, if you can find a way to make them the good guy, like, no one's going to turn that down. They love to be a green hero.
Exactly.
But it's but it takes a lot of creative work to figure out what's the route to do that in such a way that you're not asking them to be the guy that suffers when everyone else is making money. You have to sort of put their hat on and imagine them, and then see a way to do it. It's not to say that the result is going to be solve every problem, but what we've seen is you do one project like Pike Royal with 200% green plot ratio, or you do OASIA with 1,100%.
Wow.
You've kicked the chair out from somebody who says this can't be done, it's too expensive, it doesn't work on a commercial project. So then the only question is like, not it can't be done, but the question turns the other way around. Why can't you do it? Why are you finding it a problem? Is there a way we can share the experience? Is there different ways of doing it in a different situation? So I think building small examples and prototypes are really important in that it really does change the conversation. And I think the way things move forward is by a series of steps like this, where suddenly, it's not like it can't be done. It's just like it can be done in that way, in that place, and there must be a way of doing something similar here where, maybe the situation is quite different, but
Yes.
Why not?
Yeah, great. So in most of your projects, maybe located in Singapore, and in a dense city like Singapore, you created like mini cities inside these cities. And I was just wondering how these mini cities just interact and integrate themselves with the environment and also with the city.
Yeah, so I think that approach, we realize that when projects get quite big, they do start behaving like cities. So we came up with a term which is macro architecture and micro urbanism. And so the idea that once a building gets to a certain size, you need to navigate it like a city. You do need neighborhoods, you need destinations, you need public space. And I think the more you can integrate that with the city outside so that it becomes a sort of seamless connection, the more successful and integrated the project will be. At the same time, so that's sort of micro urbanism. The macro architecture bit was because we thought, actually a lot of urban design is only two-dimensional. For most of the 20th century, it was about a master plan with use groups, applied to different sites.
Right.
And there's a limit, we thought, to how far that can go, really, because it's sort of, it's two-dimensional. It treats the surface of the earth as just like a piece of paper. But we realized as we started looking at sustainable urbanism, there's things like access to sunlight, your energy layer, for instance, your planting layer. These are all things that need to be put up the top of the building, and that in order to achieve that goal of sustainability, buildings can't just be doing one thing. You can't just have a pleasant residential tower. Maybe that tower's got to be generating its energy, it's got to be growing its food, it's got to be harvesting its water. So if you look at all these systems across the site, you realize you have to start planning it three-dimensionally. Maybe in the dense city, you need a second street level, 10 stories up. So that means you need a three-dimensional master plan where you're saying all buildings have to connect to their neighbors at, level 50 meters above ground level. And so that's where we thought it's starting to turn design of the city into something like architecture. So that sort of macro architecture is looking at urbanism as a three-dimensional problem to solve in terms of light and air and access and organization.
Yeah. I have one question for one of our followers. I will just pop it up here. Sorry. Sorry. Okay. I was just going to ask this one as well, but here we are. We have discussed, any advice for young graduate architects or young generation of designers, architects who want to become an architect in the future, students as well?
Yeah, well, I think, I think it's a challenging profession. So you've got to really love it. Almost all our clients are people who used to be architects and then crossed over to become developers. But I think, my advice, I think, is really, I think all fields of design are about imagining a better future. And so I think that's the really critical thing. If you can imagine where we should be going in 50 years, that can tell you where we need to be going next year as a step along that journey. And so I think it's really important to build a vision of the future where you want to bring us to, and not just see it as like cool Instagram stylings, which are very seductive, but I think in the end, they're not really that meaningful. I think what's really meaningful is to be able to imagine this future, be able to communicate it to people, to be able to build consensus around it. This is where we all want to go, because architecture, you don't do it alone. You need to bring a lot of people on the journey with you. So I think it's that's one piece of advice. Another one I think is to learn about everything. What's scary about the world is everybody's a specialist, and nobody seems to feel it's their responsibility to pull all these things together. So there's like an enormous lack of generalists. And architects are one of the few professions, I think, architecture, where you have to be a generalist. You have to know a little bit about structure, a little bit about mechanical, a little bit about detailing, something about weather.
Actually, a little bit about everything.
Everything, yeah. And so we're one of the few people who are actually qualified, I think, to solve some of these problems coming up, because the problems are generalist problems. It's like, how do you balance transport versus embodied energy of going high? How do we solve that problem? So you end up having to go to a lot of experts and asking them the right question that's in a framework where you are sort of defining an area of interest, and but nobody knows the answer. And I think that's where it's a tremendously exciting profession, because there's so many things we don't know yet. And even simple things with sustainability, like recyclability versus embodied energy. I don't know the answer to these things. There's like 100 ways of calculating it. And there's so much research to be done, so much knowledge to be shared, so many things to test out and try. And I think it's that testing out and trying that is so much fun and so exciting and so rewarding. So yeah, I would say just read about everything, be interested in everything, follow every rabbit hole that, when you're, something interests you, and it will come in useful sometime, maybe not for 5 years or even 10 years, but eventually you'll go, perfect. I know the answer to this. Yeah.
I have a good question actually from one of our followers as well. what is challenging to work as an architect after graduation? But hopefully, I think this question goes to all architects. What is the challenging work to work as an architect?
What is challenging? I guess, well, the hardest thing I think when you finish your degree is that you find out you still don't know anything. And you think, how could I spend 5 or 6 or 7 years getting to this point? And I actually only have, you know, the vaguest idea about fire safety and escape distances. And so a lot of people have this terrible depression after finishing, because I thought, you know, at last I get to work on a project and design something. And instead it's like, oh my God, I've got so many things to learn. And the hard thing is, until you kind of internalize a lot of these things, often your solutions, you know, maybe they solve 3 out of the 10 problems they need to solve. So you present it to your boss or your project director, and you're all excited that you've come up with this brilliant solution, and then you sort of get slapped. No, it doesn't comply with escape distance. Go back. And so you can feel terribly depressed that you feel like you're just sort of not in control of all the information, you know, and then you find the client likes something that you don't like, but they're really, so it's sort of, I think a lot of, there's a period probably of 5 years extra after graduating where you're sort of building up a whole lot of skills about how to deal with all these real life issues, and learning how to input them in all into the design, and also learning this funny kind of headspace, I think, which is sort of solving simultaneous equations. Like if you try and approach it in a linear way, you never get to the end of it, and you're always being sort of sideswiped by a new piece of information that means everything you just proposed is invalidated by this new piece of information. So you sort of learn the skill of being comfortable in a state of three-quarter solution and expecting to be thrown off the rails, and having the adaptability to sort of go, oh, okay, if that means that, then I'll do this instead of that. And that takes quite a long time to build up that skill. And it can be very stressful until you realize that, I think everybody's in the same boat, you know, so you don't have to be stressed about it. It's learning to enjoy it, because that point where you actually get good at handling weird bits of information that arrive at the last minute is actually the point, I think, where you're an architectural designer.
Yeah, exactly. I had the same experience when I graduated as well. So I would like to go back to your projects. Would you mind me asking about the projects as well?
No problem.
Okay. When we look at your projects, how do you ensure to capture the human scale in your buildings? Because most of your buildings are in large scale, and how do you make it easier to users to engage with these large scale buildings?
Yes, I think that one, actually we had very good training by accident for that when we were designing hotels, because when we started off designing hotels, the guest room is really critical, you know, getting it exactly the right size, designing the interiors, the bathroom. And at the same time, you were sort of perfecting the room, you would be working on the master plan. So working sort of 1 to 20 maybe, at the same as working as 1 to 1,000, for instance. So I think, and actually in those days we were doing it all by hand. It's actually very much easier now, I think, on the computer to switch scales, because you've got this sort of infinite zoom, which in a way stops you getting too trapped at a particular scale. But in some ways it's also confusing, I think, because you don't have a sort of quantum jump between scales. But that's something we always do. So if you're designing a block of apartments, you're designing at the apartment fine scale detail at the same time as the building. And so working at the human scale as well as at the urban scale simultaneously, I think that's how you get a project that feels good at both scales. Otherwise, if you sort of work it up at 1 to 5,000 and then 1 to 1,000, by the time you zoom in, you realize you've created these horrifying spaces, because, you know, it's suddenly like it looks small until you zoom in and then you realize it's something completely out of scale.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that, you know, that working on CAD and computers has made, and Google Earth, these sort of things, so interesting now is you can actually collage and assemble things that you know feel great and put them together, and so you can actually sort of build a project conceptually in all different kinds of ways that we didn't used to do. I think what's weird about architecture is most of the training still seems to assume we're like an 18th century gentleman on our drawing board scratching with our ink pen. You know, it's sort of in terms of architectural teaching, although there's sort of often exploratory ways of doing things, but it still comes back to this dry set of drawings. And I think often people just sort of end up thinking about lines and not thinking about space. And I think there must be space and details and objects, and so I'm sure, like, we're always looking for ways now to see how we can combine sort of collage, work with materials, work with clipping things and putting them together, just in trying to free it up. And in terms of documentation too, it's like in terms of using BIM and things to actually put three-dimensional views into documentation, which is still not very common, actually, surprisingly. So, you know, you do a horrible set of section and elevation and plan, and you want the contractor to have to sort of reconstruct it in their head rather than just showing a three-dimensional view of it, which is so sort of easy for everyone to understand the intent behind it.
Exactly. Exactly. I just saw one question in the comments section. I'm going to ask about it. How do you think AI and artificial intelligence, computational and parametric design tools will help architecture in the future to find efficient solution for global warming or for pandemics or anything like this, urban life? What do you think about it?
I actually think it's kind of tough because I think where parametric is amazing is with I think it's actually better with less parameters, and the parameters probably less practical. I don't know, because I actually think, I mean, say something like, for instance, optimizing sun shading. It's never just sun shading, you know. It's also like, what's the view you're looking at? How far above ground do you want to look down? Do you want to look out? Is there something interesting on the horizon? So there's so many kind of cultural judgments. And the sun shading, you know, if it's like 70% effective, it's probably just as good as 100%, because maybe, you know, if it's really sunny and someone's hot, they'll pull the blind down. And, you know, so there's a kind of human side and a layer of interaction with so many other parameters that I think in some ways it's one of those things where we go, oh, if I could just come up with a foolproof system, I wouldn't have to have this stress of design anymore, you know. So I think a lot of parametric is thinking like, oh, I want to get away from the subjective, you know, there must be a right answer. But I think it's, it's not to say it's not a fantastic tool and it can really optimize some amazing things, but I also think it's like architecture is not an exact science. It's more, as I said, it's sort of a jack of all trades, and it's a kind of a negotiation between so many competing factors that I think it's actually good that we can't make a machine do this, because we'd all be out of a job. I think architects may be like the last people still in a job when everybody else has been overtaken by the robots, because it's such a combination of kind of cultural flows, spirit of the time, as well as really boring stuff like, you know, size of sewer pipes and things like that. You know, it's a very, very strange profession in the way we have to negotiate between so many parameters. And I really think it's good for us that that our parameters are very vague and ever changing. But I mean, in another way, like if you were sort of designing a solar canopy that you wanted to funnel wind down into the city, like I think if you can define a set of parameters that you particularly want to get an optimized form that's very exciting, I think it's great for that sort of targeted design exercise where you want a level of efficiency and also the beauty of efficiency, and a sort of a design that's just so sweet and elegant. I think parametric is really useful for that. Great.
One last question I will ask about your School of Art project, which has been featured in Westworld Season 3 as well. I think it was episode 3 or 4 in both episodes. I just saw this project. So how do you think these kind of projects are trying to change the goal of science and fiction in the future, and also how science fiction is affecting architecture?
Okay. Can you still hear me? I think my earphone something went off.
I hear you. I hear you.
Okay. I might get a bit closer to the. I think it's going through my
okay.
phone now.
You can take it off if you want to talk with phone. Exactly. Actually.
Okay.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I hear you. It's perfect.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we were a bit nervous when we heard they were filming Westworld in a few of our projects because, you know, we weren't sure if it was going to be dystopian, and our projects were communicating a sort of terrifying vision of the future.
Yes.
But it was really fun to see them in the project. So in the School of the Arts was actually I think it's a hospital or an apartment complex that the I'm betraying the fact that I haven't watched it properly. The guy who's sort of like a hitman, and he's doing this job to earn money to save his mum. His mum's actually staying there. But what's really amazing about the project is they're really like in a single kind of series of scenes. They're cutting between like 4 different countries. And mixing it all together, so you get this city that's sort of nowhere in particular. So having seen it and knowing where our projects are, it's quite amazing the continuity. I mean, I've got a new respect for actors that they must have filmed the scene weeks apart, and yet it flows together as a sort of continuous space and a continuous narrative.
Great. Love it. Yeah, thank you.
We also had they had a murder in the pool on Park Royal too, so that was quite fun.
Yeah. Are you watching Westworld?
I am. I've watched the first few, but then I've haven't caught up with the last few episodes. Yeah, okay, I loved the first 2 seasons. They were great.
Yeah, it's getting exciting. So it's been almost like 50 minutes we're talking. So thank you so much for joining this live session. Do you have any final words to say to our followers?
I guess just be positive. Architects have to have a positive future, a vision of the future. It seems pretty crazy at the moment, but it will pass. And for me, I'm really excited. I think the virus, the positive thing that's come out of it is it's brought back a real sense of a collective and a community that we all have to solve the problem together. And I really think this attitude is something we need to solve the climate emergency. So what I'm hoping comes out of it is a little less rampant individualism and a little more sense that we can only prosper as individuals when we're in a really strong and caring society. So that's what my message for everybody is when we recover, remember the caring and the community aspect.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Love it. Thank you so much, Richard. Thanks for joining to this live session.
It's been a real pleasure, Hamid.
Great. Thank you. Looking forward for more sessions like this. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye.
Guys, thank you so much for watching this live session. Looking forward to do many kind of these live sessions. On Thursday we have free Fernando Romero, a very well-known architect from Mexico. Stay tuned with us, and don't forget to like and comment. Don't forget to send your questions to us. We will ask them from the architects, and stay tuned with us. Thank you. Goodbye.